Welcome to this virtual service of the San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. We are located in Georgetown, Texas. My name is Billy Adams, and it is my joy to express our gratitude to you for joining us in the service today. For those of you who are not familiar with the Unitarian Universalist tradition or with our congregation, you will find information about both at the end of this service. We invite your inquiries as well as your future participation in the life of this congregation. For this Easter Sunday, our service will be centered around the renewal of life that we celebrate with the coming of spring and in the Jesus story. Reverend Lou Snead, a retired Presbyterian minister who actively participates in our congregation, will deliver the sermon today. We hope that you will find this service to be educative and inspiring. Thank you so much for joining us.
We gather today in the light of another springtime when nature brings life out of the darkness and death of winter. We gather today in the light of holy moments when our spirits have been renewed by the inspiration of love, courage, and hope. Let us open ourselves here now to the process of becoming more whole. We light this flame in gratitude for gifts of life we have been given. We light this flame to remind us of our connections in this community of faith and the challenges we face in standing on the side of love, justice, and peace.
Feel free to sing along as Jan and Joe Nesheim play our hymn, Wake Now My Senses.
Welcome to this service on this day that Christians around the world are celebrating Easter. I want to acknowledge, however, today that I'm a little uncomfortable about delivering a sermon for this day and for this congregation. After 40 years of preaching, it's not that I'm unaccustomed to delivering a sermon, and I've never tried to really avoid Easter. When the leadership of this congregation decided that we could no longer afford a full-time minister, I actually volunteered to preach once a month for this congregation if needed. But what I didn't anticipate was that I might be asked to preach on this day in particular for this congregation. I'm mindful that for many folks, this day of Easter and the Christian understanding about God being revealed most fully in the Jesus story, and particularly about Jesus being raised from the dead, is problematic for many UUs. It's problematic for me. After preaching 35 years to a bunch of Presbyterians, I had my own reservations about this part of the Jesus story, about resurrection from the dead. I'm kind of like the Hazel Motes character in Flannery O'Connor's novel Wise Blood. Motes was the religious skeptic, and he said he had problems with the resurrection because from his experience, anyone who was dead stayed that way. The invitation I was given to preach for today was even awkward in itself. My wife, of all people, said that she signed me up to preach here on this Easter Sunday with one instruction. The worship team, Lou, would like for you to preach on April 4th and do something related to Easter. That felt a little bit like asking an anti-gun advocate to go and say something at an NRA convention. Really. I tried to laugh it off rather facetiously by asking her, well, does that mean they want me to say something like Jesus saw his shadow after the resurrection and what that means? Can you understand my awkwardness that I'm feeling today about what I should say to all of you as you use about Easter as a spiritual matter? We came to this UU fellowship ourselves, and it was the desire somewhat to get away from a lot of the preoccupation with Jesus and the afterlife that you hear in many churches. And now, with the collusion of the worship team, I'm being thrown into this spiritual briar patch. Thankfully, in the larger spirit of Easter and springtime, I was offered a measure of hope as I was trying to get over my hesitation about accepting this invitation to preach today. My wife did say, oh, by the way, the worship team noticed that the theme from the Soul Matters curriculum that we are following is becoming. So go ahead and throw something in too about that theme. Thank you. So I'm inviting you to ride along with me for a little bit this morning as I try to navigate the potholes, theological potholes, and avoid some of the speeding atheists on this road to Easter. Remember, you can always turn off the video for this virtual service and go get a snack. You may want to do that.
Please join as we say our affirmation together. The doctrine of this church is love. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humanity in fellowship to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other.
Good morning, San Gabriel. So happy to be with you today. I've brought a wonder box with me. Here it is. Shall we do some wondering together? We'll help each other learn and grow with our guesses. Fairly noisy today, so let's not wait. Tell someone near you what you think might be in here. And let's open it up. Carrots. Now, why would I have carrots in the wonder box this morning of all days? What animals do you know that particularly love carrots? Of course, bunny rabbits. Have you been seeing pictures of rabbits lately? Maybe a special rabbit in particular? We associate springtime with rabbits when the sun comes out and warms the earth and plants begin to grow and animals have babies. Winter is but a memory. Easter today is a Christian holiday that is celebrated in spring. Christians are celebrating their belief that Jesus came back to life after he died, a true miracle. It's terribly sad when someone we love dies. We can keep that person alive in a way by remembering them, by keeping their memory alive, and by living a life that honors that person, that would make that person proud. I'm going to tell a story now about a rabbit. It's my favorite, and you've heard me tell it before. One of my favorites. It's about a rabbit, but it's not about the Easter Bunny, but it is about a special rabbit who was well loved by his rabbit friends, who inspired them to change and try new things. It's called
Rabbitiness by Joe Empson. Shared with permission by the publisher, Child's Play International. Rabbit liked doing rabbity things. Rabbit liked hopping. Rabbit liked jumping. Rabbit liked twirling his whiskers. Rabbit liked washing his ears. Rabbit liked burrowing, and Rabbit liked sleeping. Rabbit also liked doing unrabbity things. He liked painting and making music. This made Rabbit very happy. It made him so happy, all the other rabbits caught his happiness. He filled the woods with color and music. One day, Rabbit disappeared. The other rabbits were very sad. They couldn't find him anywhere. The woods were quiet and gray. All that Rabbit had left was a hole. A deep, dark hole. But down the deep, dark hole, Rabbit had left them some gifts. There were lots of things to make color and music. In time, all the rabbits discovered they liked doing unrabbity things too. This made them think of Rabbit, which made them happy. In fact, this made them so happy. They filled the woods with color and music once again. The end.
So Rabbit did die, as all things do, but how did the other rabbits keep him close? They painted and made music. They carried his joy, his message, and his teachings. They did not forget him. They kept telling his story. Who inspires you? Who asks you to grow, to not give up, to try new things? We'll talk more about that in RE time today. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Happy Easter. So what does this Easter day mean to you? Is it just one of those traditional calendar holidays that some people celebrate and others don't, kind of like Groundhog Day or Arbor Day? Or is Easter for you more like the Christian celebration of the resurrection of Jesus with a lot of fanfare? Maybe you think of Easter as kind of a hybrid celebration, combining both some secular elements or even pagan elements we heard about, along with the Christian notion of resurrection, like maybe Christmas, where we have this merger of a lot of different cultural ideas um, that have pageantry with them. In the case of Easter, we have bunny rabbits and colored Easter eggs and new dresses and a lot of flowers. As we learned from Kelly McGinty's spring equinox service, Easter is actually rooted in a pagan celebration, marking the point where nature kind of came alive in its cyclical pattern. Again, after the slumber of winter, spring emerges, new life breaks out, and the days now are divided between light and dark. We've also learned, though, from historians that the Christian celebration of Easter was one of those where the church took over one of these pagan holidays and really gave it a Christian emphasis. The pagan celebration of the coming of spring was already a big deal when Christianity was in its infancy, so it was probably easy to do this. We know that the church tried to get people to trade in Eostre, the god of spring, and Ostara, the goddess of fertility, for Jesus's victory over death on the cross. Well, although Easter has become for many of us a Christian celebration, the old Easter pagan celebration still shows up at times in the temperament of the spiritual melting pot that we live in today. So we have gifts of Easter being chocolate covered bunny rabbits and Easter eggs and grass and baskets, along with Easter lilies and alleluias about Christ being raised from the dead. In the hands of the ancient church, the pagan celebration of Easter was shaped or reshaped into a spiritual event centering on the Jesus story. We can only imagine the challenge that the church had trying to convince people to move away from the celebration of new life at springtime to this idea that this man, Jesus, who was killed by the Romans on a cross, suddenly came back to life again. The church obviously thought that the ritual of springtime was probably as good as any to start celebrating the resurrection of life that Jesus, they claimed, experienced. But I wonder what kind of struggle the church had to ask, first of all, naturalists to believe that a dead man somehow miraculously came back to life. And then many of us, even with modern sensibilities, have problems with that particular idea or that kind of miracle. Consequently, most progressive Christian biblical scholars and many preachers today point out that the biblical stories about the resurrection of Jesus contains what we might call hyperbole. rather than the literal ideas about coming back to life. Hyperbole. Hyperbole, of course, is an exaggerated experience that wants to underscore the impact of the experience. You know, like the idea it was so quiet you could hear a pin drop a mile away, or she was as thin as a toothpick. It's hyperbole. While traditional Christianity has consistently promoted the idea that Jesus was resurrected from the dead as kind of God's miraculous saving act for humanity, the church really has often overlooked some of the older biblical New Testament passages that describe Jesus's resurrection in spiritual terms rather than physical terms. In the second century world, where life was pretty fragile because of disease, warfare, this promise of new life after death likely had a huge appeal. The idea still does today. I have family members who are Christians who like to say when they learn someone's died, well, he's gone to be with Jesus. The early church also had to explain how Jesus, who they claim was the human incarnation of God, could be put to death and what that death meant. The early church ended up providing what I think is something of a theological gymnastics, claiming that God of love somehow needed the sacrificial death of a holy man in order to forgive humanity of our sins, which begs the question in itself, well, who created humanity to be sinful? Do you see why I said in my opening words that I have some trouble with this idea of Easter being about the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, at least as traditional Christianity has presented it? So don't expect me to pull some kind of Christian rabbit out of a hat today with regard to these traditional ideas and claims about Jesus's resurrection from the dead. Here's what I can say about Easter as a Christian. It's a celebration of new life, the cycle of nature for sure, and it's a spiritual reminder of the importance of hopeful gratitude grounded in the power of self-giving love. That love was seen most fully, according to the Christian story, in the life of Jesus. Pagan religion certainly understood that there is a spirit in life that comes around in renewal, at least in nature in springtime. It bursts forth in new ways. After this most recent winter storm, I've been very pleased and delighted to see our trees now budding and the flowering of the fruit trees. Things are coming back to life that I thought really may have died. Joy and hope and beauty emerge in springtime. So many of us can embrace this Easter affirmation that life itself is really good, especially when it comes back out of what seems to be death. There are good reasons, why some people get off an airplane during an emergency, terrifying landing and they immediately want to kiss the ground. I am one of those who happen to think of Easter primarily in Christian terms. For me, the Jesus story about his death on a cross and the disciples' experience of seeing Jesus return to life is a spiritual metaphor. It's a metaphor for the unending power of love and hope that comes out in the midst of our living, even in the face of despair and trauma and death. As the Christian faith has long maintained, the belief in the resurrected life only makes sense in the face of death, in the face of darkness and despair. Living through this pandemic, of course, for the past year has made many of us acutely aware that illness and death can come knocking at our door in the most unexpected moments with little or no warning at all. Feelings of despair actually have been nagging at us as a nation for some time now. The loss of jobs and unemployment, the sense of many have been left in some kind of financial ruin, in our isolation away from family and friends, and the activities that have been disrupted, in a massive amount of racial injustices, as well as economic inequities that have come to really seem to contradict our best moral ideals, and the really tragic amounts of hate and violence that we've been witnessing. And even among all of these animosities that have come out of our ideological and political differences. I heard someone say just recently that he had stopped listening to the news or reading the newspaper because he said it's become so depressing. No wonder, it seems to be a lot of people now are on antidepressants in the face of death, despair, trauma. Hope is a very precious thing for us as human beings. I remember a conversation I had in 1998 with the oncologist who was treating my wife at the time for lung cancer. When she received the diagnosis that she had lung cancer, even though she had never smoked a day in her life, we were shocked. We were scared. But when we met with the oncologist, he kept reassuring us there are ways we can today can treat these kind of cancers. Yes, it's a serious cancer, but we can treat this. And so she began with almost a year of chemotherapy. After we finished the chemotherapy, we went back to the doctor, and my wife said, well, what's my prognosis? And he wouldn't answer that question. He kind of dodged it. And he said, well, we'll see. Well, let's let you heal up a little bit and we'll do some tests. And she said, but if it doesn't work, what do we do? He said, well, we have other treatments. We walked out of his office and she said, I know lung cancer can be terminal. I just need to know what I'm facing. She went in for some tests, and they discovered that the lung tumor was still growing. We went back to see him again. Her oncologist was saying, okay, I've talked to a surgeon. We think the best thing to do is to remove that cancerous lung. So she pressed again. So what's the prognosis, even if I had this lung removed, of me beating this disease. He said, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. We have other treatments and other things we can do. Let's try to do this. This is the best course of treatment right now. So we went through the surgery, and it took time, but she recovered. And we went back to his office, and she asked once again, so now, you think I'm free of this? And he said, well, we'll have to be hopeful. Yeah, let's see. And a few months later, she had some more tests, and now they discovered the cancer was in her lymph system. We were scared and really discouraged. But we went in, and the oncologist once again said, well, hey, wait a minute, we got treatments. Let's do radiation. Let's get you through that. That will take care of the lymph nodes, we believe. So she went through a series of radiation treatments. It burned her esophagus. She couldn't eat. They needed to put her in the hospital and feed her intravenously to finish the treatments. He came in every day, kept saying, you're doing great. We're going to get past this. Unfortunately, she died unexpectedly in the hospital when a blood clot broke loose from where the lung had been removed and hit her heart. About a week or so after her death, I got a call from the oncologist's office. The nurse saying, the doctor would like for you to come in and talk with him about your wife's death. I wasn't sure what he wanted to talk about, but I went in anyway. I got there and he asked me immediately, so Lou, how are you doing dealing with your wife's death? And we talked for a moment about that. And he said, well, I wanted you to come in. I remember very clearly your wife pressing on me about a prognosis. He said, I rarely try to give anybody a prognosis. Every individual is different. They respond differently to treatments. I've learned in 20 years not to try to predict what will happen. He said, but I do. I lose about 75, 80% of all of my patients to this wretched disease. And I've learned through the years that the best thing I have to offer my patients is hope. And that's what I was trying to offer your wife, was hope. And I remember her saying that she did not want to go out, piece by piece, feeling that she had lost all hope in life and she was wasting away in miserable sickness. I said, yes, I remember that conversation myself. He said, well, Lou, she got her wish. I said, I know, I'm grateful. And I said to him, yes, I agree with you, Doc, that hope's a wonderful thing to have in the midst of life-threatening and despair and discouragement. Hope is one thing that we seem that we have at times that stands up against circumstances, provides us a measure of strength and courage. Easter is a reminder to me of that kind of power that hope and love and gratitude can have for living during threatening times. I've felt that rebirth of hope on a number of occasions recently. I felt it actually when our newly elected president immediately signed the Paris Climate Accord. I was very hopeful about that. I was hopeful when he came out with a plan to try to overcome the coronavirus pandemic and assure us that we're going to get through this. I discovered a word of hope from the sister of the police officer who was recently killed in the Boulder, Colorado massacre. I listened to her. She talked fondly about her brother's good spirit and his memory that she cherished. And she made an interesting statement. She said, you know, I'm angry and I'm resentful about his life being taken in this senseless act of violence. But I am not going to let my anger and my resentment control my life. My brother, if he was here, would not let me do that. He loved life too much. Easter is, for many of us, a symbol of hope. According to progressive biblical scholars like Marcus Borg, for instance, the resurrection stories about Jesus' disciples going to an empty tomb and discovering it, no sign of Jesus there after 3 days from the crucifixion, should be heard, Borg says, as in a spiritual sense rather than in any literal sense. Borg says that many, if not most, American Christians have been led to believe that this was a literal event, that if any of us had been there on that Easter morning, we would seen, the resurrected and reborn, renewed life of Jesus standing in front of us. Borg goes on to say, but that's not exactly how the gospel stories themselves talk about the resurrection. Borg points out that they want to say that something happens there. It doesn't seem like a literal resurrection. That Jesus who shows up, walks through walls, he tells they can't touch him except for one case, that he speaks in kind of metaphorical and mysterious ways about what's happening. Where is he going? What does his life after death mean? That he's not going to be with them any longer? The literal interpretation of the resurrection, Borg argues, is why many of us, both inside and outside of the church, have struggled with this particular belief. Borg and some of the modern theologians seem to suggest that we might make a metaphorical interpretation of the resurrection to replace this literal interpretation that the church too often has made. They note that when the followers of Jesus came together and the sorrow and the loss of his death at the tomb, they discovered a new life emerging in his memory. They recalled Jesus's stories. They recalled his message. They recalled his deeds as acts of compassion. And something emerged in them, the sense that he was still around, he was still present to them. This is a metaphorical notion. The effect to say that Christ is risen is really to say that in the faith statement about the power of his moral teachings, he's calling to us to live in self-giving love, to practice justice, to offer forgiveness, and to celebrate really the grace of God. This is kind of like Martin Luther King affirmation and notion about living by the vision of a beloved community. We remember with hopefulness the inspiration of MLK's vision about equality, even though it hasn't yet been realized. It has some power. I take this Easter language to mean that the death and despair do not have the final word about the meaning of life for us. Easter represents what we might call a spiritual conviction that love has the power to conquer suffering and hatred, that peace can emerge out of warfare and violence, that justice can conquer fears about scarcity and those not like us, and that hope can drive out despair and cynicism. So, where do we find such hope? I often discover hope only when I go looking for it. Easter is a reminder to me that the rebirth of Jesus came through the inspiration of his acts of compassion toward those who were really on the outside of God's chosen people. Here's a bit of hope that I found recently. I was reading a denominational magazine from Presbyterian Church, and I found an article written by a teenager, a junior in high school. She had been real involved, she said, in her church's youth group. And because of that activity, the church elected her as a youth representative to sit on the church's leadership board. And she said she did that proudly and with some anxiety, being a young person among all of the older adults there on the board. She said about the time she started serving, there was the shooting death of Breonna Taylor in Louisville. And suddenly the nation again was transfixed around racial justice issues, and protests broke out in Louisville as it has in many cities. And she said, of course, people were stirred by this senseless and tragic killing. And so she said, some of us in our youth group wanted to ask the church to put a Black Lives Matter flag on the church lawn. We have a large white suburban church, and we thought that's the least we could do, to make a witness to what we stood for as a congregation in our neighborhood. She said she was disappointed when she raised the issue. Immediately, some of the older members of the church who served on the board immediately said, no, we don't want to get involved in that political issue. They didn't feel comfortable. They said the best we could do would be to put a sign up that said, no justice, no peace. That's about all we would be willing to do. She said she left the meeting discouraged. She went and talked to some of the other youth in the church, and they told them the story, and they said, you can't take that response. You need to go back. You're our representative. You need to say, we need to make a statement. So she said she went back, and here's what she said. She said to the leadership board, this church has taught me the importance of loving our neighbors, and Jesus calls us to stand up for our neighbors when they are in need or when they are rejected and abused. Most of us will never understand what it's like to be Black in America, but we know that as white people, we have privileges and influence that people of color do not. So when young people like me hear our church saying that all lives matter, we see racial issues differently. For us, it's like saying that there is a house on fire in our neighborhood. The fire department comes and begins putting water on that burning house. The insistence, though, that all lives matter would be like insisting that the fire department start putting water on all the homes, even though only one of them is burning. She said when she finished giving that statement, the pastor asked if there was discussion, and to her surprise, the older member who had been most vocal about not wanting to get involved in this Black Lives Matter stood up and moved that they install a Black Lives Matter sign on the front lawn of her church. Stories like these give me some hope. They actually remind me of Emily Dickerson's poem where she says, "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, that sings the tune without words and never stops at all. And the sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chilliest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me." Who among us doesn't need that kind of Easter? I wish you the Easter of hope and love and joy.
Our hymn is Hope Lives Again This Easter Day. Not only does it speak of hope, but also of love and joy, peace and beauty. Sing along with us on this joyful day.
Hope lives again this Easter day. Loud hallelujah, sing and play. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Hope lives again this day. Joy is reborn this hopeful day. Sorrow and sadness melt away. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Joy is reborn this day. Peace now may reign this joyful day. Hatred and war will pass, we pray. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Peace now may reign this day. Beauty abounds this glorious day. Earth shines in glorious array. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Beauty abounds this day. Love's power we know this Easter day. Love conquering death has
As we end this service, take the light of peace, joy, and understanding with you. Carry the light of hope with you into the days of fear and despair that may come our way. Nurture the light of compassion that is within you to lift the spirits of those surrounded by darkness. Celebrate the blessings of new life in this journey filled with sacred moments and mysteries.
Within many progressive Christian communities today, the Easter proclamation about the resurrection of Jesus has shifted from the question about did this event really happen to what does this Easter proclamation mean to Christians today. Here are the words of Episcopal Bishop John Spong as he tries to express what this event means. Bishop Spong emphasizes the transformational nature of the resurrection of Jesus, which means he moved from an earthly, human, a great teacher, a healer of his day, and became a spiritual power representing the power of love that persists over time and place, revealing, he believes, the presence and nature of God the Creator. So for many Christians like Spong, to say Jesus lives is to make a faith statement about the ongoing, enduring power of self-giving love that was enacted in the words, the acts, and the deeds of Jesus of Nazareth in the stories of the New Testament. So on this day that we call Easter, I leave you with Emily Dickinson's Bird of Hope that she says should never stop singing. In that spirit, happy Easter to you.